Chapter 13. Perspective. The Third Hell. Sincroft. The touch scampered across the dark street, giggling maniacally and panting as they all followed their master's order. Watching them reminded Crinan of trained dogs as opposed to people, and he found it to be a strange sight to behold.
"Get over here,"
Karsten hissed, waving Crinan over to his position. Crinan saw that Malinka and Ander were already behind Karsten, and he hurried over to join them.
"Sincroft's a haven for us prisoners,"
Karsten whispered.
"We can arm and even kill the demons here. They raid us sometimes, drop a lot of good loot if we somehow win. This is one of the few places in the Hells where we have any semblance of freedom. Racking my brain trying to figure out what the hells you lot are, though. You're definitely a prisoner, but what are you two?"
"We are your salvation, Karsten," Ander replied. "We have procured a means to escape the Hells. I am certain there is room for one more if you would like to join us."
"Escape?"
Karsten nearly shouted.
"What the hells do you mean, escape?"
"We have a plan in place to get out of here," Ander continued. "We have a benefactor on the outside."
"Benefactor, Y'all gotta be touched,"
Karsten mumbled as he shook his head and readied his revolver.
"Ain't no such thing as getting out of the Hells. Damn kids and your idiotic idealism. Hells will break you. I guarantee it."
"So, I hate to break up the evangelizing or whatever you think you're doing, Ander, but what's the deal with Handjob Henry there?" Crinan asked as he pointed to the naked man who was still shucking his corn cob in the middle of the damn road. "Do we just leave him?"
"Players won't touch him," Karsten said. "They'll just avoid him. Most sane folk don't want no part of that."
"Betsy!"
Handjob Henry cried out as he arched his back.
"Woo, Betsy!"
"Well, that's weird," Crinan sighed.
"Quiet, you,"
Karsten whispered.
"Demons are getting closer."
He pulled a second revolver from his hip and then lightly clanked the barrels of the weapons together. Crinan heard the footfalls of the demons stop, and then Karsten's herd of touch suddenly charged. They screamed wildly and hissed as they swarmed the two demons. Crinan heard shouting and the sounds of swords ringing free of their scabbards. Karsten rounded the corner and began firing his revolvers, whooping as he did.
"I can hurt them,"
Crinan heard Malinka whisper softly. He turned his head and saw that she was talking to herself.
Yes, I can."
At that, Malinka emerged from the corner of the building and charged toward the flailing demons. Crinan watched for a moment as she sprinted forward, not slowing as she leapt through an opening between two of the touched. She slammed into one of the armored demons, tackling him to the ground, and began screaming as she planted her thumbs into her target's eye sockets. The demon wailed, and Crinan hurried up to assist.
"Well, you can die, I guess,"
Crinan snapped as he shoved his sword through the second demon's neck. He ripped his blade free, and blood spewed out. The demon silently fell to the ground, gasping and grabbing at his throat.
"Player, Executioner 3334, executed. Player rank 1,655,887,114. Congratulations, Pretty Kitty 6969420. You have advanced in ranking. Previous rank 1,689,016,798. New rank 1,672,451,956. Previous percentile 79%. New percentile 79%.
Crinan glanced over at Malinka, whose thumbs were knuckled deep in the demon's eye sockets. Crinan winced at the sight and kicked over a sword that his target had dropped. The weapon slid across the bleeding cobblestone street toward Malinka, and she quickly pulled one of her hands free. A stomach-churning sucking noise sounded as her thumb was pulled from the eye socket. Malinka took hold of the sword and promptly shoved it into the demon's side, passing through his lungs and heart. The demon's wailing stopped, and he fought to breathe, but finally went limp on the street. Malinka panted as she laid down on top of the demon for rest. She still held onto the hilt of the sword and refused to let go. Krynen looked over at Ander, who stared at the sight with a strange, morbid curiosity. He turned his head and looked at Karsten, who was gently fanning his face with his hat and chewing on the end of a cigar.
"Y'all are a bit on the brutal side, ain't you?"
Karsten asked with a frown on his face.
"I guess a person's gotta do what they gotta do to get the job done."
Karsten hummed softly to himself and stroked his stubbly chin in thought.
"You know, I might just know how to get you out of here after all. But you're gonna have to be willing to help me a little in exchange for my knowledge."
"Oh, for fuck's sake," Krynen replied. He glared at the elf as he approached. "How about we just don't play games and you tell us what we need to know?"
"Son, if I gave a damn about whatever sort of bullshit pointless quest that'll lead you to your next death, then I'd be happy to do things your way."
Karsten poked Krynen in the chest, pushing him back a step.
"But until I do care, if you want my help, we do things my way."
"Well, I don't want your help then," Krynen said, turning away. "Come on, let's get out of here." He began to walk away, but when he realized Ander and Malinka weren't following him, he briefly stopped. Turning his head, he looked their way. "Are you coming?" Malinka stared back at him silently. Her eyes were glazed over, and she had not yet come down from the violence quite yet. Krynen's gaze made its way to Ander, and he shook his head. "We must discover what this being has to offer, young one," Ander said. "If he can aid us, then we should listen to what he has to say." Krynen didn't turn around. Instead, he looked down at the blood streaming between the stones that made up the street. He watched it roll past his stupidly decorative boots and internally debated whether he had the time or patience for all these people. Finally, he turned and glanced at Malinka. The look was brief, but it sent a fluttering through his chest. He saw the Camlosian woods they'd got lost in together again. He heard her voice. She wasn't who he remembered. Malinka was broken. Her spirit was gone. Her undefeatable outlook on life had crumbled. Seeing her as a grown adult was a terrible contrast to how he remembered her. For a moment, it gave him pause. Surely he wasn't so bold as to believe he could fix or heal her. He thought it over. His role in her salvation was done. She had been freed from those who held her captive. Now what? Was he simply to protect her until she was whole again? Would she ever be whole again? Was it even his place to protect her, or should she protect herself? Krynen grunted over the conflicting thoughts in his mind and finally spun around. "You know I didn't have to save you!" he shouted at her. Everyone turned and stared at him as he suddenly started his unexpected tantrum. His frustration with her lethargic demeanor was irrational, yes, but it boiled inside of him until it was uncontrollable. Malinka looked at him. Her expression was still emotionless, but at least he had her attention. "Yeah," Krynen continued. "I could have left you with them, you know."
Okay.
Malinka replied with a shrug.
Thank you.
"For what?" Krynen asked, confused by her response. "All I'm saying is—"
Be grateful. Cheer up.
Malinka asked. Her tone remained flat.
You think I should just fall into your arms and celebrate the acts of my savior?
"No, just—" Krynen suddenly realized he had talked himself into a hole. He had lost control and made a damn fool of himself. He quickly remembered why he avoided everyone. Fuck. He lowered his head and turned away, pacing for a moment. "Can't you just move on?"
Move on.
Malinka slowly repeated.
I died, Krynen. I died and then came to a place designed with my eternal torture in mind. I was quickly snatched up by that group. They passed me between themselves like a toy. I could not fight, and my pleading fell on ears that would not hear. My pride was stripped from me. My body defiled. How, Krynen? How do I move on? If you know, please tell me.
"I don't know," Krynen admitted. "Like, the old Malinka was—"
She's dead,
Malinka quickly said.
So is the old Krynen. I know you want to help and you think this little tough love pep talk is the way, but back the fuck off, Krynen. If I am to heal, then I will. But for now, I need you to not talk to me anymore.
Doesn't bother me then, Krynen spat. I guess you're not who I remember.
Guess not, Krynen.
Malinka sat as a single tear fell from her eye. She was quick to reach up and wipe it away. The single tear sent a tremor through Krynen's heart, and he wished he hadn't said anything. He regretted his words, hated himself for them, and wished he could go back 2 minutes and just be quiet.
Well, that was annoying as shit,
Karsten said with a nod.
If you two are done with whatever the fuck that was, and I reckon we can get on with what I was hoping to propose. May we proceed?
Sure, Krynen said with a roll of his eyes.
You sure do have a nasty attitude on you little snot stain, Karsten commented. Reminds me of one of my boys back when he's about your age. What are you, 15, 16?
I'm 23, Krynen replied, offended.
Never would have guessed,
Karsten said.
I suppose one day you'll grow up a little and start acting your age. Maybe when you find something that's important to you.
Karsten glanced over at Malinka and tipped his hat.
Anyway, down to business. If it ain't beneath that big ol' ego of yours, go ahead and follow me, Krynen. We can talk while we walk.
Karsten began walking down the street. He gave a whistle, and his herd of touched quickly ran up and flanked him. Malinka walked past Krynen, shoulder-checking him, and Ander snorted and gave him a pat on the back as he followed. Krynen was left standing alone.
"Oh, fuck me then,"
Krynen grumbled as he jogged to catch up with the others. He didn't understand what he had done to piss everyone off, but he had done it. He thought back to multiple times in his life where he had done the same thing and deliberated over whether he regretted them or not. He felt like he never actually tried to piss people off, it just happened that way. Very few people in life were able to put up with his attitude, with his overall grumpy demeanor, and he would be lying if he said he didn't prefer it that way. The less people around to bother him, the better. The group walked in silence for a bit. In that time, Krynen passed by several residents of Syncroft. They all looked dirty and pitiful, emaciated and covered in scars. Some were huddled around burning metal barrels, holding up their hands to the fire. Krynen briefly reached out at one of the barrels as he passed, realizing that the flames didn't give off any heat. He thought that was strange. The fires of the hells had been unbearably hot thus far. He thought about it for a moment, and then Ander called to him. Krynen hurried to catch up with the others, and Ander walked alongside him. For a moment, the two walked in silence, but then Ander spoke.
"Life is a funny thing, is it not, Mr. Jameson?" he asked.
"Don't call me that," Krynen groaned at the formality. "Just Krynen."
"Ah, yes, Krynen." Ander laughed softly. "That fire is supposed to give comfort. That's why the citizens of Syncroft created it. Yet it yields no warmth. It provides not a moment of respite from the woes of this terrible place. Our overlords ensure that such joys are withheld from us, even in our own city. Why, what would damnation be with small reliefs?"
"I mean, if you give some relief, then that builds them back up," Krynen replied, "and then you can take it back from them. I think that would be more sinister than just keeping it from them in the first place. Give a kid a toy and then break it in front of them after they've grown to love it, then they'll wish that they never had the toy to begin with." Krynen glanced at Malinka and then quickly back to the ground.
"What a delightful observation from someone so young," Ander said. "Perhaps it is you who should be ruling over the hells. It is clear that you understand pain."
Krynen did not reply. He heard Ander release a thoughtful hum, then the Vampire spoke again.
"When I speak with you, a part of me is reminded of someone I met long ago. My memory, however unclear it may be, leads me to feel that he was nowhere near as morose as you. We labored endlessly in an attempt to understand the depths of mortal pain and desire. Goodness, I wish I could see it a bit more clearly. I believe we determined that the two concepts are more closely related than you may initially think, Krynen. Pain and desire, a longing for and a regret of not having. Such concepts were the foundations of my work, and they are two things I believe you are no stranger to."
"To live is pain," Krynen retorted.
Desire's just the fuel that gets us to where we need to go. Once we get what we want, we go back to pain. There's never a time where people are just happy with life. There's always something more to reach for. There's no point worrying about it.
Crinan, you are but a babe in the eyes of Dura, Ender said, gently patting his back. Yet I venture to guess that you have lived a life centered around pain. I believe you have endured so much pain, seen so much pain, that you believe there is nothing more. I tell you, my friend, there is so much more.
Says the guy who spent most of his life in the hells, Crinan snorted. What do you know?
I know that my desire outweighs my pain every day, Ender replied. My desire to see an end to all this. My faith that one day it will all be broken. There are parts of my life, Crinan, that I do not remember. Sections that I see are there, but when I try to remember them, all I see is the deepest and darkest of black that you can ever imagine. Tell me, Crinan, do you ever look within yourself and see nothing?
For a moment, images flashed through Crinan's mind. He heard gunfire, screaming, a smell of iron that he knew was blood, the feeling of the warm liquid cascading over his hand as he forced a blade into a body. Crinan saw himself alongside his friends. He watched as they raided a Govian encampment, recalled his orders of no quarter. He thought of the civilians within, the teenage brothers who screamed as he torched their tent. He saw their flaming, burning bodies try to escape and felt the recoil of his weapon as he squeezed the trigger over and over. They were innocent. Govian, yes, but deserving of death? No more than he was.
I try not to look within myself, Crinan replied.
Is it because you do not like what looks back?
Ender asked, curiosity bubbling in his tone. Crinan heard his own grunting as he wrestled the charred, dying young Govian to the ground. His skin was blackened and smoking, flaking off and blowing away in the wind. His chest was littered in holes, Crinan's own doing, and leaking blood that was never meant to see the light of the twin sons, the brothers as they were called. Crinan heard the wailing, saw his eyes dart wildly and fearfully. He heard his own words.
Just stop! Stop, and it'll be over! You killed Petrov!
The teenager shouted.
You're killing me!
Crinan watched his own blade enter the boy's neck just under his jaw. He felt the power, the life drained from him, along with every hope and dream the person had ever considered. He remembered feeling pity on the boy. He remembered trying to comfort him.
I'm sorry, Crinan whispered. I'm sorry, kid. It's okay. I promise it's okay.
It wasn't okay. It would never be okay again. Not for the brothers that Crinan had killed, not for him. From that day on, their lives were his responsibility. Not only theirs, but every single life he was faced with taking in pursuit of liberating the world from Govian control. They weighed more heavily on Crinan than his own flesh. It was like the blood he drained from his victims replaced his own. He could feel them within him. They were there, and Crinan was tormented by their silent presence daily.
That's enough,
Crinan replied, shaking his head at Ender. You're not my fucking doctor.
I would like to be your friend, though, young one, Ender whispered. Perhaps someone somewhere scripted this. Perhaps this was meant to be. Our paths crossed, Crinan. What will become of it?
I don't fucking know, and I don't fucking care, Ender, Crinan snapped. I don't believe in fate. I don't believe in the goddess. All I believe in is me.
Very good, my friend, Ender said. Faith is best placed in oneself. Come, it appears we have arrived at our destination. Let us see what this Carsten fellow has to offer.